Okay, so thank you everybody for attending the last Bytes of Innovation webinar of 2021. As you can see, we had some very great speakers this year, and of course next year we will continue, and we hope to have a very nice next series of webinars next year. So a little bit about the webinar. So Bytes of Innovation, it is a deep dive into the future of medicine. And we do this with renowned experts such as researchers, physicians, lawyers, and investors. We usually do it every other Thursday. Since this is the last one of the year, we'll have a little bit of a winter break. The next one will be on January 13th with Robert Pearl, who is the ex-CEO of Kaiser Permanente. For now, the Bytes of Innovation webinar, usually it's 15 minutes of talk by the presenter, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A, which is moderated by Aline Lutz, who is the medical director at SecMed, and it's moderated by me. So all the participants, make sure to put your questions in the chat box so that we can discuss them during the Q&A part of this webinar. So for now, for today, I am proud to announce that we have Marta Gaia Zanchi amongst us. So she is the founder and managing partner at Nina Capital in Barcelona. Amongst others, she has a very impressive CV. I just picked out some things that were most impressive. I think she was the founder and the director of the Biodesign for Digital Health, and that's a program within the Stanford Center for Biodesign. She holds a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from Politecnico di Milano and a PhD in Electrical Engineering from Stanford. And today, Marta will talk about data and AI meets medicine meets education. Marta, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin.
And share my screen.
Very excited to be here. Let's cross our fingers for my sharing of my screen, making sure that everything works correctly. And okay, please confirm that you can see your slides.
Yes, we can see your slides perfectly. Go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present this webinar. This is a great opportunity that doesn't come across very often to speak about my three favorite topics: technology, medicine, and education. And so I thought that I would take this opportunity to have a conversation about what I believe sits at the intersection of these three dimensions in the future. And this starts with actually an assumption. There is always a bias. When we talk about the future, we always have to start with something that we deeply believe, but I'm not going to now make the case for, which is that there is a need today to rethink medical education. It is timely, it's becoming extremely compelling to do so, and the reason why is that we're already seeing the applications of data and AI in healthcare maturing to the point that it presses a sense of urgency for us to see what goes on inside the classrooms in our medical institutions and beyond in the life of physicians that desire to stay up to date with the development of the technologies they use in their daily practice. I thought to break this down in three parts. So the first one is actually to think about what we should be teaching our physicians inside the classroom during their medical schools. And I have a little bit of experience in that. I was privileged, as Martin said, to teach about 350 students, postdocs and physicians at Stanford University. They came together to my programs in multidisciplinary teams. And so I had the privileged to actually see the differences in their curriculum and to inquire with the students about how the experience that they were receiving was different from the core education that they were getting from their respective departments. And so this is part a reflection on what I've seen in the literature, because I continue to try and stay up to date on how curricula are evolving, and part a reflection on the things that I wish I could be doing if I were still in an academic environment. Again, this starts with an assumption, and the assumption there is that it's a rather accepted concept today that machine and man are always connected. So when I think about what is needed to bring inside an academic setting to prepare physicians for an understanding of artificial intelligence, I always think of these as the basic premise upon which a curricula is designed. Technology will be a fundamental part of the future, and the two will need to work together. As to again, trying to make the case for why this is true, the best example that I could find in literature comes from an article by Liam McCoy that I reference in this slide. Physicians don't need necessarily to understand the physics behind the particle spinning in an MRI scanner and the difference between T1 and T2 weighted scans, but they still are educated on how to use this technology. Depending on the clinical context, they need to be able to decide which technology and which scan in particular to choose. They need to be able to interpret it themselves, and once interpreted, they need to be able to explain it. I like this example a lot because I was trained as an MRI system designer at Stanford University, but there is perhaps an even simpler example to be made. Nobody would question a university teaching a physician on the functional principles and the appropriate use of this stethoscope. So why not AI? So we're not here to argue that physicians now turn into AI developers, but that they are given the tools to actually use it, interpret it, and explain it. So what AI is, how it works, but most importantly, how it differs from other sources, from other forms of technology currently in practice, is becoming an imperative. And the last one is particularly interesting for me in thinking how to form medical curricula. Because perhaps this is the biggest difference in the way in which an understanding of this technology needs to be reflected in the particular lessons learned during the years of formation of a physician. You learn in medical schools about what an ultrasound sensor is, and you think of it as something that is relatively static, or at least it was. Now AI is coming to ultrasound. So that, a number of years ago, you had an ultrasound and then you use it, and 2 years later, it's still the same ultrasound. Maybe the technical performance of it has deviated a bit because the technology is starting to be a little bit misused, and you got the little bumps in the closet of the physician, but it's fundamentally the same technology, which is not true for AI at all. It's not a stagnant function. And it requires to be constantly analyzed, evaluated, and updated. And so I think crucial is particular to instill a sense of the provider's role in oversight of AI applications, as well as the concerns that surround it, both regulatory and clinical, as it is used in a clinical work setting. So right, more classes. I'm sure that physicians in school are thrilled to hear it, but I do think that it is important, and to try again to make the case for it, I'm going to give just a few bullet points. So it is important because we're learning that actually artificial intelligence models do quite well in control settings, but perform surprisingly poorly in real-time medical settings. They should know that. They should know that models are more accurate, unfortunately, for certain populations, which generally the data which is used for the training of those algorithms. Typically, there are differences in demographics, and this algorithm tend to work well for underrepresented communities, Black, female, low-income patients. There are differences also in one geographic region with respect to another one. And not only that, if you have an algorithm that is trained on the most diverse data set, you can still see a calibration drift, population change over time. And so even in the best trained models, the performance of your neural network of your model can drift over time. So, and one more reason, if I haven't compelled you enough, many models actually aren't being documented quite well right now. So if you expect to just say, I'm going to figure it out in the real world, I'm just going to read the spec sheet that comes with the model, you're going to be very disappointed because the same amount of rigor that is used for other technology is not true here. We see that models are not particularly transparent on whether they were tested for unintended bias, if they are very reliable, and it's not really that developers are being bad. It is poor guidance on how to report, and this is the technology field of the frontier. So we're still learning how to do this correctly. Perhaps even more sneaky instead is the fact that many models are even that helpful, frankly. So what we should try to teach our physicians is to be able to question the utility of the models that they're provided in a real-world application. So let's say that I have convinced you. I want to go back to something that I said in the beginning. It's rather accept the concept that AI is coming and man and machine will collaborate. There is actually some resistance yet, and this might be part of the reasons why we don't see yet this much education as we would expect, given instead the continuous implementation of these technologies in clinical practice. I think there is, first of all, some real concerns. So as I mentioned, it's actually not wrong that there is a lack of strategy for integrating AI. It is still very often a case-by-case basis. It's still true that sometimes AI is not being very well documented, may feel like a black box. But there is certainly some misunderstanding, and that is the primary cause, I believe, of hesitancy around the AI in practice and in education, along with a more fundamental resistance to change. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but we have seen examples from the real world. Radiology and pathology, for example, are two specialties in which the collaboration between man and machine has developed further. And so we can break this cycle. The path to significant curriculum reform remains different. It's a system that's very entrenched. There is an accreditation process that everybody is very concerned about breaking. The definition of what it means to be a professional is changing, and that doesn't help necessarily move towards a change in the curriculum, paradoxically. There is lack of faculty that has the appropriate expertise to create and deliver curriculum. And as I mentioned before, students are really overwhelmed as it is. So there is a hesitation around adding more lessons to be learned in their formation years. And there are, in fact, more articles on medical students and faculty burnout than on the bringing artificial intelligence inside medical schools. But there are opportunities to make small steps for future success of this implementation. On one end, there is certainly some opportunity to bring literacy around big data, which is the premise of artificial intelligence concepts such as volume, variety, velocity, and veracity, and just an opportunity to learn the alphabet and be able to be more informed and inquisitive towards AI models that then they're given in clinical practice. And there is an opportunity to invest in continuous medical education as well as bring educators from outside the medical community. The last one is actually not so immediate and not so easy, but there is an opportunity to refocus learning on knowledge management rather than the information acquisition approach that has been used in medical schools. And that will go a long way, actually, to preparing students to appreciate what skills are needed to deal with AI in the professions. There are some universities that do it well. So I listed three, for example, University of Toronto. Some publications that are included in this presentation come from professors that are active there. Harvard Medical Schools. You can look up the clinical informatics training that is done quite well. And then Humanitas University, just to bring back to Europe, which is where I'm talking from. The second point that I want to share in this webinar with respect to the intersection of data, AI, medicine, and education is that there is an opportunity to educate physicians on themselves being at the front end of innovation in this field. So this is not about understanding what AI is, but actually empowering them to appreciate the opportunities for being those that create artificial intelligence models in the future. There is a flip side to the framework that I explained in the beginning. Remember, advocating for physicians to be able to use, interpret, and explain AI. The same author, McCoy, offers this very useful framework to think about how physicians of the future will be trained to be evaluators, interpreters, communicators. He has a layer of understanding of how to be a responsible handling of data on behalf of the patients and of the institutions in which they work. I personally advocate for a few things that are missing from this framework and that should be taught in school. Physicians as an innovator, equipped with the knowledge, the skills, and toolkits to be at the forefront of designing new health technology innovation. And there you can look up by design. guilty as charged to actually have been one to promote this framework very broadly. It's a very useful one, and it's one that is educating physicians since 2001 at Stanford University. An opportunity for physicians to be thought to be collaborators. Yet again, there is a belief that the future medical practice will be more and more a partnership among physicians, professionals from other disciplines, machines, including AI, and of course, let's not forget patients. So curricular attention should focus on the organization of professional efforts among all of these parts. And this is a bunch of soft skills that it's very hard to acquire. But I think it's worth an effort to do that from very formative years of medical schools. It goes hand in hand with teaching physicians to be more of a compassionate provider, where machines are able to do their job as machines. There is an opportunity for humans to be more human. And so I think we can actually embrace some reflective practices that come from humanities-based academic environments to teach students of medicine how to be more empathetic towards the patients, and in doing so, themselves as well. Goes back to the comment before that there are more publications about burnout of physicians and students than AI in medicine. And some universities know as well, I already mentioned Stanford Center by Design, but not only. Back in Israel, I gave an interesting talk to a bunch of physicians with the Rabin Medical Center in occasion of a conference that they organized. And so, again, the message is spreading that physicians actually play a vital role for needs identification and characterizations, and they do have the potential to increase safety efficiency as these AI models, which I mentioned, are not static, continue to be used in a clinical setting. By the way, in a capital, I mentioned managing director, we have made 25 investments in companies all over the world, and more than half of them were actually funded by physicians. One of them is segmented by Martin. So it can be done, and when it happens, actually, it works very well. And the last point that I wanted to bring is actually at the intersection of artificial intelligence, medicine, and education, there is a third opportunity, which is not about teaching AI or how to use or develop AI, but using these technologies to rethink the way education itself is done. And these are just some ideas for low-hanging fruit for changing the status quo. For example, the status quo is disappointing because we continue to see that meaningful continuing professional development suffers from very high barriers to access and inequalities in global healthcare setting, just about information access. So technology can be applied. I'm inserting here a shameless plug, one of our investments in a capital that actually applies technology to start breaking down this barrier. And this is even before we start talking about AI. And then why not bringing in AI models to actually understand, for example, the scope of a physician's practice and recommend opportunities for education. I'm thinking of, for example, the potential to monitor a provider's patient panel, the outcomes, and then recommend educational resources just in time. And perhaps this is used to understand the scope of practice, and again, targeted assessments for continuing certifications. There is an opportunity to, not in the real world of practicing, but in medical school, actually support physicians, students with one of the most important decisions that they need to make, which specialty to choose. And the cost of a poor choice is tremendously high. You can lose an aspiring physician to another profession. So why not models that actually enable precision education by identifying individual performance trends, making recommendations, supporting in the learning, and specifically in this choice from medical school to residency and beyond. And then step back, forget the individual, think about the healthcare system as a whole. There is continuous learning that happens in the field, and it's not just about the individual physician only. It's about the whole system, the whole hospital. And each healthcare provider, it's a learning system on its own. And perhaps the data is already there to speak about the opportunities for learning. So why not these technologies to actually, identify opportunities for improvement in the data which is already inside the hospital, so that those insights can be turned into education programs internally to meet not just individual, but the collective learning needs. These are just some reflections. Wherever I cited the source, you can find a link in my presentation, which I'm happy to send it to you, by the way. You just have to send me an email and I'll be glad to send you the PDF. Plus my own observations, as I mentioned, a former health technologist turned academician turned investor. I'm happy to take any questions, and as usual, I spoke too much. Sorry, I'm 2 minutes past time.
Thank you, Marta. Very, very good presentation, and it's a very interesting topic for us at SegMed. So now we are starting the Q&A session. We do have some questions from Michelle. So she asks about the knowledge management versus the information acquisition, I think. So she would like to know more about the distinction of these two.
So the question is about the difference between information acquisition and knowledge management. So as mentioned before, my belief about what goes on inside medical school today is a lot of absorbing, memorizing facts and names and data. So it's a very mnemonic exercises of acquiring information that is out there that is considered for the most part static, or actually at best moving very slowly with the kind of a low cycle of increasing of medical information over time, which is measured in a number of years. So that's how medical school is today, at least for the large part. And I'm sure I'm not being fair. There are many professors that would now raise their hand and say, this is not all we teach, but this is what most medical students continue to tell me. I'm advocating for actually bring more skills to actually manage knowledge that complements these absolutely necessary information sets that they need to acquire with skills that instead are useful in processing that information and also in relating with other professionals in the same field, professionals from other fields that are now brought into the team that is tasked with providing cares and recommendations, and as well interactions with the machine as well. So this is not just about AI. It's part of, I think, a bigger trend that I believe is necessary in this increasingly technological world, to teach students not just facts or beliefs, but skills to actually process the continuous and accelerating knowledge that they have to develop in the field in an ultra specialized discipline that is medicine today.
Thanks. I have another question. So you said that medical students and physicians should understand more AI and eventually be users of AI. But what if they want to propose solutions? How can they approach it? How can they navigate the technology world?
Oh, that's actually, I love this question because it allows me to brag once again about biodesign and actually refer you to the Stanford Bio Center for Biodesign resources that teach a process for how to go from original observations of needs in a healthcare environment all the way to development of technology and ventures. You don't need, by the way, to become all the way an entrepreneur to enact change. Just the first part done right, the thoughtful ability to observe opportunities in healthcare environment, to record those opportunities in a systematic way, to communicate those observations, and to characterize those observations in the form of needs with specifications that can be fed to others. Oh boy, would that be already extremely helpful. And what could be the result of it if you are not interested in, I don't want to be an entrepreneur, I just want to be able to share what the problems are. I can imagine more publications dedicated to need observations and need finding. I can imagine opportunities for deeper collaborations between academic hospitals and hospitals in general, with teams that come from other specializations that collect those needs, and then with the collaboration of the medical staff, actually think about opportunities for licensing, technologies, patenting, developing spin-offs, and so forth. But a lot of physicians don't know how to collect observations, right? They don't know how to translate those observations into needs and then to specifications that are fed into a design thinking process. I'm sure some of you are rolling their eyes and say, what is she talking about? So there is an alphabet and there is a methodology. It's 20 years old. It's called by design. And I really would like to see that as part of every doctor's curriculum, because I believe it would accelerate tremendously the opportunities for innovations that are in this field, in AI and beyond.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a great program that Stanford offers, and you've been a big part of that, of course. But what if a student is not, like a part of Stanford or Harvard or University of Toronto or Humanitas? Like, what can they do to learn more about this and to be involved in this space?
Yes, well, as I said, first of all, if you are actively a student, many of the resources that are developed by these universities are accessible and for free. You can look at the lectures and videos recorded by Design in a website accessible to all. You can buy the textbook on Amazon. So there are opportunities for education, and at Stanford by Design, we have tried our best to reduce the barriers to access of that education. We can only have so many students at Stanford and at Stanford by Design, but everybody can have access to that training material and get started. And as far as physicians who are outside the school, again, one of the opportunities I see is reducing the barriers to access to continuous education. And I cited one of the companies that we have invested in on the belief that it is a very imperative need to address today. So I would actually encourage students to sort of, after they finish the medical school and are no longer students, but they're lifelong learners, to mobilize and create content, share content, and actually join a growing community of young physicians that want to continue to bite away at those barriers to access to continuing education. Technology is there also to support that, and that is already possible today.
Yeah, I think that's very inspirational. That's a great way to make this more accessible to the community as a whole, and not just to the more privileged students maybe that are part of certain universities. So one of a different question, one of the problems that SACMED is trying to tackle is the problem that you mentioned about the demographic and the geographic limitations of data sets. So we're really trying to create more heterogeneity in the data that's used for AI training, testing, and validation. What do you think could be done in education to maybe tackle this in the longer run if people understand this problem better or something? Do you think there could be a role for education there?
Yes, I think, I mean, maybe call me naive, but I think if we can educate physicians and the educators about this particular type of limitation of AI, then by forming students that are more inquisitive and more attentive to these limitations, we can actually perhaps see a role of those institutions towards the creation of those reporting requirements that we are lacking today. And in particular, requirements around on what data set was this model trained on, who was not represented and might be contraindicated for use of these AI. And here are opportunities actually for contributed data sets to these AI in a controlled environment so that it becomes more robust. So I think that by educating students to be more informed about the limitations, inquisitive about how exactly this model came to life, then I see a role for teaching hospitals and students to actually participate in the creation of those reporting requirements that we're still missing. And that's what I see. And that's part, by the way, of being an innovator, understanding what the problems are and then mobilizing towards contributing to a solution to it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We ran a little bit over time, but we went a little longer with the discussion because I think it was a super interesting talk, and also the Q&A afterwards I think was very interesting. So thanks a lot, Marta, for all of this. And I think it's a great last webinar of this year, and we are very excited to continue next year on Thursday, January 13th. So I hope to see you all there. And for now, thank you, Marta, and all the attendants that were here today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.